Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte.
Hello, and welcome to Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. My name is Iain, and this is about the 20th time that I've tried to record a podcast in the last 2 days. I'm not sure quite what's wrong with me. There's something in my brain that when I sit down in front of my microphone, at my desk, in front of my laptop, that everything just goes blank. That everything seems to evaporate from my brain, and my tongue gets twisted, and I feel a bunch of pressure. It's like a stage fright that I haven't had in recording of 6 months now of monologuing. So this is a little tough today. I want to get on to what I want to talk about, but I'm just going to work through something first. I reached out to my network on Blue Sky and said what I just said, basically. Having a bit of podcaster's block. And I got some good advice that I'm sort of trying to practice right now. So thank you to everybody who gave me some advice on trying to get my creative juices flowing. I'm not from a performance background, no formal speaking training. I came up through lab work, science work. I have always had to do some public speaking, but usually I have a PowerPoint or a kind of well-rehearsed script from week to week, basically, that I can rely upon. I know my PhD work, I know my postdoc work, it's in my brain. Recently, I've been picking up and putting down the podcast analysis stuff a little bit more to try to give myself some balance and to pace myself a little bit in terms of what I'm actually producing for you guys. Previously, over the summer, when I started this podcast, I was kind of going full tilt week by week, listening to as many pods as I can and trying to turn out an analysis of some sort every week, a sort of a sentiment analysis of how people felt. And I decided this summer that I would sort of step back and restructure a little bit. I felt like I wanted to pace out those kind of sentiment analysis of how the podcasters are talking about Spurs to a more of a fortnightly or monthly thing, to give it more time to breathe and for opinions to be followed up on by me. And to try to space it out in between with more kind of portfolio analysis of these podcasts, more analytical stuff in between of the kind of metadata of podcasts. And so I think because of that, I got out of the groove. It became harder to talk in front of a microphone, especially after interviewing Flav from The Fighting Cock and appearing on Rule the Roost with Jack. Huge thanks to both of them, but there was a kind of pressure that I felt turned up, like there was more attention on me and I had to do more good work. Or better work. So thank you to Stu from CADS, to Milo from The Game Is About Glory, and a few other people on Blue Sky who just gave some advice in terms of overcoming creative blocks. Stu recommended what I'm doing now, which is just kind of getting in front of the microphone and talking about whatever, not necessarily the subject that you want to talk about. And I think it's helping. Thank you, Stu. And somebody else recommended, thinking of the person or thinking of a person you want to talk to instead of a huge audience. And again, that seems to be helping. I'm not thinking about anybody in particular, but if you'd like me to in future, let me know. If you would like me to think about presenting this to Big Ange or Daniel Levy or somebody, just let me know. So after having recorded 5 minutes, I feel pretty good. It's hard. But it's hard podcasting. Anybody who's a podcaster and listens to this, which I'm assuming is probably a sizable chunk of my of my listenership compared to other podcasts. I'm sure there's some interest there. It's hard to get down and to switch off a part of your brain that tells you to shut up, to that what you're saying is boring or has been said before. That can be difficult to switch off, especially in such an open, raw format where you are laying your opinions out there for other people to argue with or disagree with, or could embarrass you, or you could be wrong. Like, it's hard. It's hard podcasting. It's hard whether you're talking to 5 people or 5,000 people. I think it gets easier, but possibly the longer you do it and the better you get at it. But it's still challenging, and especially so for the style of podcast that I like to do, or at least that I've done the most on this show, which is kind of a solo effort or a monologue. Those are tough, right? It's just you and a screen. I've got a ring light on me for God knows what reason. It's basically blinding me right now. But it's just you and your voice and your thoughts. And in my case, I'm currently staring at a spreadsheet with 100 and something Spurs podcasts on it. And yeah, so that it can be challenging. I had Mike from Wicked Spursy say, yeah, it's tough to sit down and do half an hour, however long you want to do, of just not rambling, but trying to weave a story for people to be engaged with for an hour. And so that's the way I'm doing it, because that fits my lifestyle at the moment. I have a young-ish child. She's in elementary school. She's amazing. I have a wife. She's not in elementary school. Bit weird. And she's amazing too. But to be able to schedule a regular thing on a weekend, I just feel like I can't do it. I've got too many kind of family commitments and work stuff to do. I do pick up, I do drop off of my kid. I don't have that sort of free time aside from, 9 o'clock on a Wednesday evening to sit down and lay myself out there for you all. So I solo podcast. I monologue. There's a lot of people who monologue in the Spurs podcasting space. I already mentioned Jack from Rule the Roost. He does a solo reaction style pod to games on a Saturday or a Sunday, but he also does interviews or conversations with people. A lot of the YouTubers, George Achalea, apologies, George. Alasdair Gold is a solo guy. Ben Bowman does a great job of it. And that's a very hard style to get right and to make engaging, because you have one voice, one perspective. But there are other types of podcasts, as you well know. Globally, if we zoom out from Spurs podcasts for a second, you've got panels, right? We've all heard them. Panel groups of people getting around a microphone or getting in front of their laptops and having a chit chat. Full-on interview style, podcasts where somebody is asking an expert to weigh in and give opinions and tell stories. There's the serial style of podcasting, which is more documentarian-esque. You've got kind of mixed media podcasts of people putting together, interviews conducted alongside archival audio, things like that. Conversations, fireside chat type podcasts. And this is the type of stuff that I want to talk about today. The kind of the whats, the wheres, the whens, the hows of Spurs podcasts. Because as I described some of those formats, you might recognize some of them. Like the panel style is exemplified by something like Last Word on Spurs, or maybe The Fighting Cock. The monologue is, again, myself or Ben Bowman. The interview style is used very well by someone like Flav from The Fighting Cock on The Lab, or Jim from Also Spurs when he has an expert on. the fireside chats are very popular amongst Wicked Spursy, who I already mentioned. So yeah, there's a few different styles, and I thought it'd be interesting for me to go through and figure out the lay of the land, the landscape, kind of like a portfolio analysis. This is like my day job merging with my hobby. This is what I do for my 9 to 5 is categorizing stuff. And so yeah, we're going to be talking about that. Talking structure, formats, geography, timing, length. Because again, if I zoom out in a different way, I often get asked by people to recommend podcasts. Like, oh, you're the podcast guy. What should I listen to? And very often I have one canned response. I often say the game is about glory because, especially on Blue Sky, it's beloved. But there's so much more to it than that. Like, what are you looking for? How much time do you have? How often do you want to listen to something? Do you care if they're an American or a Brit? Like, all these things are kind of important, really, when you're trying to give somebody a response which is unique to them, rather than just saying what a good podcast is. It's useless to recommend somebody the Last Word on Spurs format if they don't want to hear voices that could change every week, or they don't want to hear from Brits, or they don't like the length of that podcast, or conversely, somebody who doesn't want to hear somebody solo monologue for 20 minutes, like Barnaby Slater from Spurred On. There are different strokes for different folks. What I'd like to do is take this data that I've accumulated, and there's a lot of it because I'm a maniac, and turn it into some kind of format to help people make a decision about finding a new podcast or dipping their toe into this world, or just generally speaking, trying to group podcasts together for kind of similarity analyses. How it's useful for me going forward to be able to decide how I pick which podcast I listen to within a week. Do I want to listen to entirely panels or entirely conversational podcasts or just journalists? There are some approaches that if I don't have the data there at hand, I can't make an informed decision about how I structure myself. So, yeah, going through my list of 108. We've lost some podcasts recently. Golden Guest Talk Tottenham have hung up their mics for now, and we've gained a couple. Yeah, that's like 108. We have about 108 podcasts at the moment. No, 106. I've got 2 not actives here. Some pods that have gone inactive over the summer. Anywho, yes, there are some pods, 106-ish podcasts. Yeah, so I can't listen to all of them in a week, and I need a way to track them. I need a way to categorize them. And also, in the future, I think it'd be a fun podcast to get somebody on and use this type of data to help them pick a podcast to listen to and see what they think. See if it works. So let's dig in. Where's my running order? Here we go. So yeah, my methods. Okay, so I have a spreadsheet. It's in my Google Cloud, Google Docs, or Google Drive. God, I sound like such an old person. And in it, I have the 100 and so podcasts that I've identified previously. If you haven't already, go back and listen to my favorite Spurs podcast analysis episode. It's a good listen. I think people have liked it based upon the listenership numbers that I can see in Spotify. I took that list and I started to think about some easy to annotate data. Things like, is it a fan podcast or is it a journalism podcast? A fan podcast would be something like My Friends at Tottenham Home and Away. A journalistic podcast would be like The View from the Lane, right? So something which is kind of an amateur fan perspective, which is more likely to be a little bit looser with its opinions, less worried about offending the club, versus a journalism viewpoint, which is likely to be a little bit more constrained in its opinions, a little bit more, you might say, professional. Some people would argue about that for certain podcasts. But also I have got a deeper insight into the players and them as people and the inner workings of the club through the connections they have. Not to say that fans don't have some of those things, but journalists, through the nature of their work, have more doors open to them and have spent more time with the players in personal chatty settings. Just, I think it was Dan Kilpatrick maybe this summer talking about having conversations with players, on tours, things like that. There's downtime that they get, but they don't live and breathe it necessarily the same way we do. Dan's a bad example because he's a Spurs fan, but somebody like Jack Pitbrook. I looked at some easy to annotate data, where the podcasts are from, where the people live, the types of people they are, the frequency that they put out podcasts, which is easy to annotate from YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcast data. But I wanted to get into things more like formats. I already mentioned earlier, I opened up this podcast with conversations about monologues versus panels. So I was also able, where I could, to go in and annotate that type of information. But I needed a helping hand. So I did put the list of podcasts that I had into ChatGPT. I'm sorry for burning down some trees to run a podcast analysis, but I wanted it to start spitting out some analyses, some topic areas that I could maybe focus on and annotate myself to augment the data that it gave me, or in most cases to supplant and replace the data, but some terminologies, some turns of phrase to help me focus my mind on thinking about these podcasts. Now, full disclosure, it's much easier for me to think about a podcast that I listen to frequently. Let's say The Fighting Cock, than it is for me to talk about something which I listen to much less frequently, like something like Holly's Hotspurs. So although I'm going to talk about that type of tonal analysis today, I think it needs a deeper look. I think it needs a little bit more of attention from me, because it's tricky. You're trying to summarize somebody's work into one or two sort of snippy, easy to digest, and broadly applicable topic areas. So I took the 100 or so podcasts, I annotated the information for their region, whether it's a fan or journalism podcast, whether they're match-going fans. I tried to annotate that where I knew from my personal experience of listening to the podcast, whether they had engaged in talking about nostalgic points of view or sort of analyses and discussions of seasons decades ago, stuff like that. Think about like the interviews that the Spurs show coordinates with ex-players. Whether they have guests, how frequently they put out podcasts, the format of the pod in terms of its composition. Is it one person alone? Is it 20 people? The tone, I did try to capture where I could, and I kept this kind of high level, whether it be casual, so just like a conversation between mates, professional in the case of journalists. There's not too many casual journalists in my opinion. And then the in-between stages, fan professional, like somebody like an Echo of Glory, I would say. That's not to say that casual is unprofessional. It's just me trying to put a label on something that I feel. And then I also did annotate where I could, like reaction podcasts, when that was the main vibe of the pod that I know of anyway. And then some 2 key selling points where possible. And finally, I also tried to capture where possible how long a podcast is, whether it's about an hour or less, over an hour or short, more like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that type of thing. So yeah, I did supplant most of the ChatGPT analysis. I'll be honest. It did a good job on very widely listened to podcasts with many reviews. So Last Word on Spurs, Spurs Show, The Extra and stuff like that. But for example, my show, Tottenham Hotspur, which I hope you know because you're listening to it, it said it was Scandinavian and focused on match-going fan views or something like that, which is not inaccurate, but I'm pretty sure I'm not Swedish, so that I threw out. but the labels and the types of ideas that it was throwing up in its analysis is what I took as the basis of my human in the loop analysis. So everything you're going to hear today is totally from my brain. But I did get assistance from a large language model in terms of crafting my portfolio analysis and some of my categories. So let's scoot over to the data I have. And there's too much to talk about in one podcast today and make it fully interesting. So I'm just going to go over some key insights that I found that I want to talk about and that hopefully you want to listen to. So the data. We're getting to the data portion of this manuscript right now, the scientific paper. So we're looking at pod formats, the structure of a podcast. I had several different topic areas or several different types of formats that I looked at, whether it was a conversational podcast, so two people just having a chat, a panel, which is a bit of a wishy-washy phrase. It basically means when you have, for me, 3 or more people, usually 4, but 3 or more people on a call recording it, typically with a moderator involved. But there can be different types of panel podcasts. You've got the roundtable style vibe of the Fighting Cock, where Flav is generally speaking the protagonist of that conversation, but he isn't trying to steer the ship into certain topic areas really aggressively, as for example I would say Andrew on the Tottenham Depot does. He goes in with a script and you can sort of hear the transitions between topics very clearly and very cleanly, and that's just a style thing. It's not better, it's not worse, but they're just different types of group conversations that are recorded for podcasts. We have the interview style of podcast where a person talks to an expert, and then we have the monologue. So some of the podcasts that I reviewed exhibit several of these tendencies. The majority of the pods I looked at had just, one style, whether it's conversational, a panel style, or solo. With panel being the most frequent that I found. But there were some, like I mentioned already, Jack on Rule the Roost, as both monologues and conversational or interview style podcasts. In total, I found conversational and interview podcasts. I smushed them together. There was about 36 of those. So sort of conversations between two people, there's 36 pods that I found. Podcasts that have a tendency or a majority solo, 37, and a panel style, 46. So the most popular style is the panel style, and I think in many ways it's the most engaging and most easy to run podcast. And that's not me again throwing shade, it's just different strokes for different folks, but there are many advantages to this type of podcast. You have, if you're a big podcast, you can attract more heavyweight personalities on. Again, look at what the appeal of Last Word on Spurs is. You have either other podcasters or social media personalities or ex-players or journalists coming into your roundtable, bringing attention with them and bringing different exciting viewpoints with them, which can keep a listener engaged for the duration of your podcast. If you're a smaller podcast, conversely, you have 4 people who with them drag along maybe a couple dozen people who feel an interest and obligation in supporting their friend or supporting their social media contacts, or that can help generate listenership for your podcast. So a panel style is a very appealing type of Spurs podcast. Similarly, the conversational interview style. Again, you've got two people, and again, they bring in different viewpoints. It's an engaging conversation. You haven't got just one voice droning on for 25 minutes, as I've done so far. And it's engaging. I'd say for both of these have some benefits in terms of prep time compared to the solo podcasters, because I'm going to insult a lot of people here. My assumption, and I've run a few panel style, I've been on a few panel style podcasts. You can just kind of rock up as a guest, have some opinions, and chat shit for an hour, right? It's easy. If you're the host, you have to do a little bit more work to have some prompts, have some topics maybe that you want to guide people towards, maybe have some facts and figures that you want to pull out, but you don't have to create and think about an hour's worth of content completely off the top of your own head, you know? So there's some reductions of burden there, which is, I think, is a beneficial thing to that style. On the flip side, you are running the risk of debates that can get out of hand, a speaker, especially if you rotate through your panel, that somebody doesn't like and turns them off your podcast. It can be a good and a bad thing. So regardless, the panel style is kind of the most frequent Spurs podcast that I identified in my analysis. And my analysis did include both YouTubers and audio-only pods. I think a good thing to look at in the future is trying to subdivide these. Moving on to how frequently people put out podcasts. The most common, as you might guess, is the weekly podcast. There were 47 of these in my list. Again, this is kind of a nice rhythm, right? You find one time per week that you get your panel on. You find time with your partner to go and sit in your podcast cave and record. Like, it makes sense. It isn't overly burdensome. You're not trying to carve out time and think about content every single day. On the flip side of things, there are 18 daily podcasts, at least. It was a bit tricky in some cases to distinguish between daily and kind of 3 or 4 times a week podcasts. I wasn't quite sure how to separate those two out, because it's almost every day, every other day for some pods. But that's a lot of content. The YouTubers especially are doing, the fan channels are putting out short videos. They're putting out, more structured podcasts with panels. They're putting a lot of stuff out there, and more power to them. Godspeed. Twice weekly podcasts. There were 19 of these. Again, this is a bit of a mix of those YouTubers who are putting out a lot of content per week, and something more like the Fighting Cock, which has one main pod after a game and then like a midweek podcast. The Extra Inch does this too. I only found one podcast that seemed to have a fortnightly schedule. I don't have that to hand which one it is. 6 irregular, so they kind of put out stuff when they want. I did include the Steve Perryman podcast in this analysis, and I think that's where I put Steve's podcast. It doesn't seem to have a super regular schedule. 7 monthly podcasts, including my good friends at Yet Another Podcast About Spurs, or YAPS. Haven't had a chance to talk about them, but they're doing great work. If you're not already listening, please do go give them a click and a listen. Owen, Stu, Doug, and Peter are doing exceptional work, trying to give a much more long-term view of the Spurs results, rather than trying to react in real time. And this is also not to say that anybody should be doing daily, weekly, monthly podcasts or whatever. I don't think there's really a benefit here. It's more from a listener point of view about what you want to engage with. And I do think it's important with podcasts to be, as a listener, in a rhythm too. The more interview styles of podcasts, perhaps you can pick up and drop. The journalists, maybe you can pick up and drop. But fan podcasts especially, I feel like one of the main selling points is getting to know the characters behind the microphone. to understand their motivations, to understand their likes and dislikes. So being able to listen to, 75% of the podcasts that they put out is kind of helpful. People have time for the fan channels, or they treat it much more in a disposable fashion. But for the audio-only pods especially, I think it's helpful. So this is why this was something that I wanted to look at. Where do these people live? Where do these people live? I said it so aggressively. As you can imagine, it's a podcast about an English football team. So 70 of the podcasts at least were exclusively UK hosts or speakers that they have on, or limited guests. That's totally to be expected. A further 11 had more of an international vibe with a UK core. Think of something like Dr. Tottenham, which has Americans and Brits on it. Again, I mentioned my friends at Tottenham Home and Away. They have on international supporters every week. That's their whole point of their podcast, is trying to get those views in. Looks like we've got 12 exclusive US pods, which again is makes sense. Tottenham Hotspur's huge in America. And then just kind of ones and twos of Denmark. You've got the White Hart Danes. El Tel Cockerel, I think, is in Spain, I want to say. I forget, or Malta. I forget where he lives. Hong Kong. The Irish Hotspur. We've got Israeli, Scandinavian pods. So they're kind of all over the place. So yeah, in total 87 UK pods, 19 US pods. And this tracks with, I think, the Reddit data that I put out in that favorite pod analysis too. How long are these podcasts? I looked at best I could. I tried to approximate things that were about an hour, over an hour, or short. So 20 minutes, 10 minutes, that type of thing. And there are podcasts like that. Spurred On is very often in the 20 minute range. Sometimes it's as little as 10. The ones that focus on kind of daily Spurs news, which I didn't think I'd like when I first started making this podcast, but I often find myself sticking it on when I'm driving in the car short distances. So there's a niche there, at least for me, for the weirdo that I am with Spurs podcasts. The majority of pods that I looked at were about an hour or less, 47 pods. 33 were over an hour. Some of these can go on for 2-3 hours. It's rather impressive. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how these YouTube podcasters sit there for 3 hours and talk about Tottenham Hotspur. And 9 podcasts that were on the shorter end of things. And again, this is different strokes for different folks. Some of my podcasts have often been that short, but I'm talking by myself, and at the time was relatively inexperienced at doing this. It's a nice break. It's sometimes nice to have a podcast that keeps itself tight and focused, but perhaps I do like. I personally like a little bit more breathing room. So about the hour mark, I think is kind of ideal. Okay, so moving on to the more fluffy, squishy analysis that I did. We're looking at selling points now. Like, what is the raison d'etre of some of these pods? What are they doing? What makes them special? If you were to try to convey them to another person, how would you describe them? This was tricky. And I think I've done some podcasts a bit of a disservice. So I'm not going to go through absolutely everything here, but the biggest groups that I found were I don't know why I paused there. The guests that they bring on, again, like Last Word on Spurs, the Spurs show, they get really good people to come on. They get ex-players, they get psychologists in some cases. They get cool people to come on and talk about Tottenham. International views came out pretty strongly. So again, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a selling point, but if you're an American, maybe you want to hear an American talk about Spurs. Maybe you don't. I don't know, but like I feel like that's interesting. The local culture, the local appreciation, the references like that, they sound like people that you watch the game with. Maybe they're friends of yours. Maybe you've met them. Similarly for like the Israeli Spurs or Hong Kong Spurs or something. There's also panel chemistry, which is the sort of the way and a group interacts, the way that they banter and bounce off each other. There's 14 podcasts that when I listen to them, that's the thing that stands out most to me. The types of people, the way they mesh together, the way they complement each other. And then we had 26 podcasts where I felt like the hosts or the host were the main draw. And by that I mean they're either like a super engaging personality to listen to, like me, or they're or you know them from social media and you've found your podcast through them. They are the draw. They are the person that you're turning up and listening to. Trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but my mind's gone blank. But think about something where the podcast has a dominant personality, or the podcast seems to be popular and it's very popular on social media. There were a few other things that came out, things that I noticed. I'm not going to give exact numbers for these, but the kind of the breadth of some of the podcasts. They cover a lot of ground when they record analytical podcasts. In this case, you coming back to like Daring is Doing, the Ben Bowman podcast, or the Extra Inch or something. Nostalgia is another thing that I picked up on, and there's just not enough nostalgia pods. Pods talking about Chelsea, United, the league in general, people doing live streams, viewer interactions. A number of the fan channels, you could say, have a pretty strong viewer interaction component where they're like reading off comments from the listeners in real time. Female voices, there's sadly not too many of them in the regular podcast rotation. Holly's Hotspurs stands out. Caroline on the Tottenham Depot. And if we're just talking exclusively about the men's side of things, obviously. But yeah, so, I wouldn't say that's the main selling point, but it's definitely a notable thing to remark about a podcast, which might be important if you are trying to recommend a podcast to somebody who's looking for somebody who sounds like them or has a viewpoint like them. We got banter coming out, I think Expressions or Same Old Spurs or somebody. Like that's the Fighting Cock is a very sort of humor forward podcast. Debate, the way that podcasts panels will challenge each other. I found I've talked about this recently, but the Spurs 5. You got Harry Scarf, who sort of puts forward a platform to support and amplify the voices of neurodivergent fans. That's something that Harry has as his mission statement. Match watch-alongs are very popular on YouTube. The Irish Hotspur does a number of those. I need to check some out, but I'm very often watching a game, so maybe the next time I can't watch something in real time, I'll listen to a watch-along instead. The age of the host is also a factor. There was one very young chap on YouTube, and I felt like maybe that could be a selling point for children, not so much an older dude. I've got dog written down here, and I'm assuming that's talking about Spurs Talk Show. Sean, is it Sean over there? He's he often has his dog on his podcasts, and I don't know, he's often arguing with him. You could put Cat there too for Rule the Roost. So, and then there's also a number of Supporters Club associated podcasts, like is it 617 to N17, the Boston Spurs. You've got the Mile High Hotspur, who's Denver Spurs, I want to say. Tottenham Depot, I think, has a link to San Diego Spurs through TC. my pod, I talk a little bit about Montgomery County Spurs, Moco Spurs. So there's a few different OSC pods. You've got, talking about US soccer comes up a few times in the American pods, as well as, Tottenham itself, and there's like Wicked Spursy talks a lot about Vermont Green and lower level soccer in the US. I got some video games as an annotation here. I forget who that was. Was that Tappin' Tobes or Too Much of E? Somebody on YouTube, they do... was it Elijah? Anyway, excuse me. They do Spurs content and also kind of video game playthroughs. So there's some kind of mixing and matching of different topic formats here, which might be of interest to some people, but a total turn off for others. The Coffee Company would be another example of that, who are on YouTube and often show up on the YouTube panel shows. They talk about Spurs, but they also seem to be a coffee roastery or a baristas or something. And if that's your thing, that's cool. Like, I love coffee. I'm a pour over monster, but like, I don't know if I want to listen to it with my Spurs content. And finally, I've got a match going versus non-match going fan analysis, which I'm trying to augment. And as far as I can tell, there's about 46 of the 100 or so pods that I listen to and have some awareness of that have a fan either as a host or as a sort of a regular member of the team that comes on and talks talks on the podcast, that go to White Hart Lane regularly. There might be more, but these were the ones that I felt confident in saying yes, they definitely do. So what's that, about half of the podcasts have somebody who's a match going fan on there. And again, it might be important to somebody that the voices that they're listening to are representative or have the experience of what's going on within the walls of Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So that's kind of the end of the annotations and notes that I have here that I wanted to talk to you about. And I just want to make it clear that this is subjective. It is just my opinion in some cases. Some stuff's a little bit more factual, don't get me wrong. Something is or isn't an hour long regularly. Something does or doesn't come out weekly. But some of the stuff that I talked about, especially the sort of selling point or notable sort of factors in a podcast, are subjective. Somebody else might have a completely different view. It's also worth noting that the sort of elephant in the room is that the main selling point for many of these pods is that they are a panel of dudes who you may or may not know talking about Tottenham Hotspur on a weekly basis. And that's the kind of undercurrent of all of these. In many cases, when I said the chemistry was the selling point or the host, it's because they don't have a specific layering on top of that. Like, we're an analysis podcast. I'm a podcast that talks about podcasts. We're going to talk to international fans. We're going to talk about, beer as well. Like, they're very... It's not generic of the word I'm looking for, but they're fitting the same... They cast the same silhouette. And I'll keep working on this, especially this type of more subjective analysis. Before I put this live and have it go out into the wild and have people turn around and tell me that I'm an idiot or wrong, I'd rather spend some more time and go through it carefully, especially when I'm going to be trying to summarize somebody's somebody's hobby or somebody's livelihood. I need to be careful. But spending some time thinking about this, I did get a gut feeling that there's something about some waves of similar podcasts coming out in different time periods. And I think of it like this. There's a first wave of podcasts that came out in the sort of 2008 to 2014 period that can best be described as men with a mic in a pub. Yeah, so think about how the Fighting Cock started out, or the Spurs show, that type of thing. You'd have people in the same location getting around a microphone of decent or not decent quality and recording how they felt and just kind of blasting their opinions at you. And those podcasts that have stuck around have kind of stayed around that similar format, even if they moved online. They've kept that same vibe. And that's very true of the two podcasts I just mentioned. I feel like there was a second wave that happened in the sort of 2014 to 2019-ish period, which can be more described as dudes with laptops in their homes and the American fan emergence. This period of time, you'd have people who are sort of evolving off of that first wave of people that I talked about, but are now in more remote locations. Technology has also moved on a little bit. It's maybe a little bit more accessible to have an internet connection that supports this type of streaming, for example. The explosion of Spurs fandom in the sort of 2011 through 2013 period, like when did NBC get the contract? It was like 2013, right? So you got a bunch of now new American fans who want to like engage with these podcasts that they're listening to and make their own. Think of, maybe not this early, but think of like Wheeler Dealer Radio. The third wave, and I'm not super sure on this, but I feel like Tactico started to appear in sort of 2016 to now. This is like the Extra Inch, Ben Bowman's podcasts. I'd even go as far to say the consideration that like Also Spurs or The Game Is About Glory apply to podcasts. Maybe that's maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but real sort of deeper. Lily White Lab would be another example. These are more sort of intentionally tactics forward podcasters rather than more sort of vibe casting that you saw with the men in the mic with a pub. Like, how did you feel? How did the game make you feel? What sort of things did you notice on the pitch? Rather than trying to build a podcast around a tactical analysis. And then we have the kind of fourth wave, which is characterized by hyper-specialization. And it's happening, I think, now, and it's been going on for a couple of years. Think of this like this podcast, this meta-analysis. The Lab is another example. It's not necessarily hyper-specialized in one topic, but it's very much trying to approach talking about Spurs in a unique way. Tottenham Home and Away only wants to talk to international fans. And I think that's happening. Rule the Roost was kind of doing this sort of its own thing 10 years ago. Jack and Raj and Seb were chatting with fans from other clubs. You know, that's a kind of specialization twist on the format. And then we have the mutant wave. Sorry about this, but the fan channels and influencers, which felt like they were growing on YouTube from like 2018, I want to say. I'm not super into the YouTube space, so maybe it was starting to happen earlier, but that's kind of, from what I can tell, the appearance of fan channels seems to coincide with that. So yeah, this would be interesting to annotate my data set with like the first appearance of a podcast, and then go back and layer in some of these sort of signatures and tonal things that I'm picking up on, and see if there's anything to my gut instinct about these kind of waves of different types of podcasts coming. And it'll be interesting to see what maybe comes next. Part of me is wondering if we're going to go back to having people recording in physical spaces again. I certainly know that like Gen Alpha, Gen Z are moving back to trying to move out of our online spaces and into, you know, the physical real world, if you can believe it, to escape the kind of algorithms and sort of all-encompassing virtual suffocation that you can feel when you're online too much. And I'd love to start hearing that chemistry develop from people being in the same place, chatting about Spurs and leveraging their connections and personalities in that way. Maybe I should do that. All right, and let's close out with gaps. You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about different types of podcasts, and I want to take a step back and say, okay, well, I've got, you know, what's there, but what are the holes? You know, I'm looking at the Swiss cheese, and I'm only looking at the cheese at the moment. Where are the holes? What's missing? What could be added to the Spurs podcast portfolio that would be new, that would be different? And I have some thoughts here. And the first thing is to say that none of these are necessarily good ideas. Like, making a podcast about podcasts isn't a good idea, right? But it's all about execution, or it's all about how you twist it and spin it. Like, you can just go out and have another panel podcast that lasts an hour, that's you and your mates who think you're the funniest dudes who ever lived, and you can put our podcast out there and talk about Spurs, and people could love it. But there's already 50 of those. So how do you find space amongst all of these excellent podcasts that makes you unique? Like, we've seen it with Yaps, right? Their mission statement is building off of their Blue Sky connections, and that's super important. That comes back to my point earlier about hosts being the selling point of a podcast. But the second thing, as I mentioned, they do things monthly. They give things time to breathe. They give stories time to evolve, and they can reflect over a full period of time instead of putting their opinions out week to week and sounding as if they're sort of crazy people changing their minds all the time. They're giving themselves more time to form opinions and gather more data. And that's the twist. So what gaps are there? Well, I did notice that although there are people who are talking about the Academy regularly, Lily White Lab, Windy still talks a little bit about the Academy on the Extra Inch. It's talked about in the Games About Glory every now and then. View from the Lane talks about it a little bit, but there's no sort of dedicated or podcast that focuses on Academy players and loanees. And I think this would be actually quite useful. It can be difficult to keep track of these kids. And I think there's room for interviews with the host clubs, with the players maybe. They might be open to that. But I think that an Academy forward podcast could be fun and could be useful. And it comes at a good time as well with this new partnership with the BBC on this Academy limited series that's just been released. There's no specialized history podcasts. I think this is something to pay attention to. We're getting to a point now where we've got some excellent documentarians out there who are making podcasts. Some of them are engaging in limited runs, like the Spurs show's History Pod, like the history of Tottenham Hotspur that they put out this summer, but it isn't like their main focus. That isn't what their podcast is. It's nostalgia is a heavy component of the Spurs show, but the Spurs show isn't about nostalgia. We've already got culture pods in terms of Hometown Glory. They have a heavy cultural component. At the end of the show, they talk about things that they're enjoying in music, art, movies, theatre, whatever. But I think a fun addition to that type of discussion would be the culture of, or how Spurs is reflected in culture, in music, in movies, fashion, whatever. Right? That could be an interesting, maybe more limited run podcast, but that could be a good sort of topic for somebody to get into. I feel like as a parent, having a truly kid-friendly pod could be fun. I've talked before about Smologies, the kid-friendly, family-friendly version of the excellent Ologies podcast, and something similar where the curse words or the bad stuff is cut out of a podcast and can be played with your kid in the car. That could be fun. That could be a good way to kind of engage kids and bring them into the Spurs culture. Something I've been thinking about, and maybe I'll do at some point, is taking snippets of thoughts, small micro thoughts throughout a week, and trying to weave them into a single narrative. I think about this a lot with the podcasts I listen to. Like, maybe I should record something like 30 seconds after every pod and then put it together and see what it sounds like. And I think you could do that same thing with a week of Spurs news. Like, we're already getting that a little bit with the daily Spurs news pods, like Spurred On or GSPN or something. But just sort of micro nano blogs that all get weaved together and you try to pull it together. Could be something someone can play with. And yeah, there's more. If anybody wants to hear more of them, we can save this podcast topic for another time. But yeah, let me know. What do you think is missing? Like, is there still space for the Spurs podcast, podosphere to grow, to expand, to be? Do we want to go deeper rather than broader? I mentioned earlier about serial. There's no that kind of narrative structure in the sports or Spurs podcast space. There certainly are in the sports podcast space, but not specifically within our little corner of the fandom. So yeah, let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm glad I managed to vomit out something for you all to listen to and hopefully enjoy. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you want to hear more of, what you want to sort of engage with. Tell me your favorite type of podcasts. Drop a comment. Do you like panel shows? Do you like 3-hour-long monologues? You ain't getting it from me, but do you like that? Do you like watch-alongs? Do you like things that mix it up, that to bring in something from the outside and augments the Spurs chat? Drop it down below and argue with other people. Drive some engagement to this podcast. Closing stuff out. This has been fun. If you've enjoyed it, share it with your friends. Drop a like, all that type of good stuff. Follow me on Blue Sky. I'm at iain.coys.social. The show is at poddenandpodspur.bsky.social. You can email me at poddenandpodspur@gmail.com. Drop me a comment. Send me a line. Send me a carrier pigeon if you can find me. Keep listening to Spurs podcasts and keep making Spurs podcasts. And I'll keep analysing Spurs podcasts. All right, bye.